Megan decided to hit the road for a weekend trip to a small town upstate. Megan had always been a free spirit, someone who thrived on the unpredictability of life. But tonight, the spontaneity of her decision would lead her down a path she would never forget. Megan had planned to take the bus, but after a mix-up with the schedule, she found herself stranded at a desolate bus stop with no other options. The sun had already set, and the cold night air began to settle in. Determined not to let a small hiccup ruin her plans, Megan decided to hitchhike. After all, she had done it before without any issues. As she walked along the deserted highway, her thumb outstretched, Megan tried to shake off the uneasy feeling creeping up her spine. The road was eerily quiet, with only the occasional rustle of leaves in the wind. It wasn't long before the sound of an approaching car broke the silence. The headlights pierced through the darkness, and Megan felt a surge of relief. The car slowed down and pulled over next to her. The driver, a middle-aged man with a kind smile, leaned over and asked where she was headed. Megan explained her situation, and the man offered her a ride, assuring her it was on his way. Without a second thought, she accepted. The inside of the car was warm, a stark contrast to the chilly night outside. As they drove, the man introduced himself as Paul, a local who had lived in the area for most of his life. He seemed friendly enough, and Megan found herself relaxing, the earlier tension dissipating. But as they drove further into the night, Megan noticed something odd. The landscape outside seemed unfamiliar, even though she had traveled this route before. When she asked Paul if they were going the right way, he simply smiled and told her not to worry. Her unease returned, stronger this time. The conversation that had once been easy and light now felt forced. The car's interior, which had felt so comforting moments ago, now felt like a cage. Suddenly, Paul pulled off the main road and onto a dirt path that led into the woods. Megan's heart began to race. She asked him why they were leaving the highway, but his response was cold and devoid of the warmth he had shown earlier. He told her it was a shortcut, that it would save them time, but Megan knew something was wrong. As the car ventured deeper into the woods, the trees seemed to close in around them. The headlights barely cut through the darkness, and Megan could feel the pulse in her neck pounding with fear. She suddenly reached for her phone, hoping to text someone, anyone, to let them know where she was. But when she looked down, she realized with horror that there was no signal. Her mind raced, trying to come up with a plan. She thought about jumping out of the car, but they were going too fast. She considered trying to overpower him, but Paul was bigger, stronger. Megan cursed herself for getting into the car without thinking, for trusting a stranger. Then, as if reading her thoughts, Paul spoke, his voice calm but with an edge that sent shivers down her spine. "You know, Megan, these woods have seen a lot of things over the years. Not many people come out here anymore. They say it's haunted, that people go missing." Megan's blood ran cold. She turned to look at him, her eyes wide with terror, but he kept his gaze on the road, a strange smile playing on his lips. "But you don't believe in ghosts, do you?" Before she could respond, the car came to a sudden stop. Paul turned off the engine, plunging them into an unsettling silence. He turned to face her fully now, his expression unreadable. "Get out of the car," he said, his voice devoid of emotion. Megan's heart pounded in her chest, but she knew she had no choice. Her hands trembled as she reached for the door handle. The cool night air hit her like a wave as she stepped out, her breath coming in shallow gasps. Paul got out as well, walking around the car to stand in front of her. He was holding something in his hand, but in the darkness, she couldn't make out what it was. Fear gripped her, paralyzing her as he took a step closer. But then, to her surprise, he simply pointed down a narrow path that disappeared into the trees. "Walk," he commanded. Megan hesitated, but a sharp look from Paul convinced her to comply. She started down the path, the sound of her footsteps muffled by the soft earth. The darkness was suffocating, the trees looming like silent sentinels on either side. She could hear Paul walking behind her, the crunch of leaves under his feet. Panic surged through her, and she fought the urge to run. She knew that if she did, he would catch her, and then she didn't want to think about what would happen next. Megan hesitated, but a sharp look from Paul convinced her to comply. She started down the path, the sound of her footsteps muffled by the soft earth. The darkness was suffocating, the trees looming like silent sentinels on either side. She could hear Paul walking behind her, the crunch of leaves under his feet. Panic surged through her, and she fought the urge to run. She knew that if she did, he would catch her, and then she didn't want to think about what would happen next. The path wound deeper into the woods, and soon they came to a clearing. In the center stood an old, dilapidated cabin, its windows dark and lifeless. The sight of it sent a jolt of terror through Megan. "Go inside," Paul instructed. Megan shook her head, backing away, but he grabbed her arm, his grip like a vice. He leaned in close, his breath hot on her skin. "Don't make me repeat myself," he whispered, and the menace in his voice was unmistakable. Tears welled up in Megan's eyes as she was forced toward the cabin. The door creaked as it swung open, revealing nothing but darkness inside. Paul pushed her through the threshold, and the door slammed shut behind them. Inside, the air was thick with the smell of damp wood and decay. The only light came from a small oil lamp on a rickety table in the corner. Megan's eyes adjusted to the dim light, and she could see the outlines of old furniture covered in dust and cobwebs. Paul moved past her, setting something down on the table with a heavy thud. Megan flinched, her fear intensifying as she saw what it was: a large, rusted hunting knife. Paul noticed her gaze and smiled, a chilling sight that twisted her stomach in knots. "I'm going to tell you a story," he said, his voice low and steady, "and you're going to listen very carefully." Megan nodded, too terrified to speak. Paul began to recount the history of the cabin, how it had once belonged to a family that mysteriously disappeared one winter night. Locals claimed the woods were cursed, that the family had been taken by something inhuman. The only trace left behind was a blood-stained crib and a message carved into the floor: "They come at night." As Paul spoke, the wind outside picked up, howling through the cracks in the cabin walls. The lantern flickered, casting eerie shadows that danced across the room. Megan's heart pounded in her chest as Paul's tale grew darker, more twisted. "They say the spirits of the dead haunt this place," Paul continued, his eyes gleaming with a strange light and a hunger for new souls. Megan's fear turned to panic. She couldn't stay in this cabin with him, listening to his madness. She had to escape, but how? The door was the only exit, and Paul was blocking her path. Desperation clawed at her, and she edged closer to the table, her eyes locked on the knife. If she could just grab it, she might stand a chance. But before she could make a move, Paul lunged at her, knocking her to the ground. The impact sent a jolt of pain through her body, but she fought back, kicking and clawing at him with every ounce of strength she had. Paul was strong, but Megan's adrenaline-fueled struggle took him by surprise. She managed to twist free, scrambling to her feet. She lunged for the knife, her fingers closing around the cold metal handle. But before she could make a move, Paul lunged at her, knocking her to the ground. The impact sent a jolt of pain through her body, but she fought back, kicking and clawing at him with every ounce of strength she had. Paul was strong, but Megan's adrenaline-fueled struggle took him by surprise. She managed to twist free, scrambling to her feet. She lunged for the knife, her fingers closing around the cold metal handle. Behind her, she could hear Paul's enraged shouts, but she didn't look back. She couldn't. She just kept running, her mind focused on one thing: survival. Megan didn't know how long she ran, only that her legs were burning and her lungs felt like they might burst. The forest seemed endless, the trees stretching on forever, but she knew she had to keep going, that stopping meant certain death. Finally, she saw a faint light in the distance, a sign of civilization. She pushed herself harder, willing her exhausted body to keep moving. As she neared the light, she realized it was a small gas station, its neon sign flickering in the night. She burst through the door, startling the elderly clerk behind the counter. Megan collapsed on the floor, gasping for breath, tears streaming down her face. The clerk hurried over, concern etched on his wrinkled face. "Are you all right, miss?" he asked, helping her. "I hope you remember to leave the lights on before going to sleep tonight. Don't forget to subscribe and like the video for more horror and suspense. See you in the next story, but beware, no one is completely safe."